All right, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session. My name is Al Kassam, and I'm the Technical Coordinator at CSER on behalf of Dan Allen, our President and CEO, and Stephanie Smith, our Events and Operations Coordinator. We're delighted to have this opportunity once again to host our annual field trip. Recognizing that people may be joining in from other traditional lands and territories, I do want to acknowledge the land that we reside on here in Calgary. In the spirit of reconciliation, reciprocity, and truth, we honor the ancestors and acknowledge the Treaty 7 territory, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. We recognize this is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Thank you. So to begin with, I want to take this opportunity to thank our corporate sponsors, GLJ Limited, for their continued support. I also want to thank Stephanie Smith for taking care of all the background technical arrangements and for communicating with all of you ahead of this session today. So today we will be investigating key elements for CCS applications in Alberta. Our tour guide will be John Node once again, and the session will be moderated by Colleen Sherry from GLJ. Before we get to both of them, I will just quickly go through some of the announcements and happenings that are ongoing at CSER. So we have a session lined up on October 4th. To discuss the integrated workflows for improved completion design in unconventional reservoirs. Our presenter will be Farhad Kanbari, Senior Reservoir Specialist from ARC Resources. The registration portal is open, so please head on over to our website for more information and to register, of course. We also have an event coming up at the end of September, calling it Saskatchewan Day. We'll have updates from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Energy and Resources, the Saskatchewan Geological Society, and the Saskatchewan Research Council. So they have a few things that they want to update us on. So we will be opening up the registration portal here soon. So look for that in our announcements. We're also finalizing details on a September 20th Alberta Day event, mostly with AER personnel. So once again, we will make the announcements here in due course. So look for those in our daily publications. Just a quick note, CSER is hiring for a position of manager and operations and events coordinator. So if you know of anyone that may be interested, please communicate this to them or have them contact us or apply directly through our website. And we encourage everyone to continue to send in their feedback to CSER through the emails noted below. If you have any ideas or suggestions for topics and subjects, please let us know. Please provide us with your feedback regarding our programs, events, initiatives, and publications. One quick note, I don't have a slide for this, but we're working on, many of you may know that the CSER is now 20 years old, and we're working on an event to highlight that event in the fall of this year. So once again, we will provide information and make an announcement as to the date and location. So stay tuned. And while this disclaimer slide is up, I'll quickly go through the logistics and mechanics for today's session. So as you hover your mouse near the bottom of your screen, a Zoom menu bar will appear. Please use the chat option to communicate with Stephanie or myself during the session, and use the Q&A option to post comments and questions for the speaker. Our moderator will relay these to our speaker as appropriate. So as indicated, our moderator today is Colleen Sherry from GLJ Limited. She is the VP for Sustainability, and she supports GLJ's expanding capacity in decarbonization narrative, energy transition, ESG reporting, responsible production, certification, and emerging technologies. She has over 25 years of operational and leadership experience. Colleen has a bachelor's in geology with a minor in geophysics from UC. an MSc in Earth Sciences from University of Ottawa, and an MBA jointly from Queen's and Cornell Universities. Colleen is also a board member with CSIR. So with that, please welcome Colleen Cherry.
Good morning, everyone. Just want to thank everyone for listening in to today's CSIR webinar on carbon sequestration, a virtual field trip. Carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS as it's known, is obviously a very important topic and is experiencing rapidly increasing interest, both from the oil and gas industry, but also from many other sectors. And today, we're happy to have with us an expert in the study of the geotechnical aspects of CCS, our presenter, John Nodes, with Sedimental Services and Stantec. John graduated in 1985 and started working as a mining geologist in South Africa. He returned to the United Kingdom to work in marine cable laying and completed a master's there in sedimentology during evening classes. This led to a full-time PhD working in Eastern Borneo, after which he joined Shell International, working Middle East exploration and in several production roles as well. He moved to Shell Canada in Calgary in 2006, followed by senior geosciences role at Murphy, Husky, and Grand Tierra in Colombia. John started consultancy in 2017 and has run more than 50 field trips and courses for industry, as well as teaching at several universities. He joined Stantec as a qualified paleontologist in 2022 and now undertakes site monitoring for new pipelines and construction projects. With that, I will pass the mic to John, and we look forward to having him tour us through the geology of CCS. And as already mentioned, questions from listeners can be posted through the Q&A link below. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Just before we start, everyone, we had some technical challenges here, so we're presenting this in a slightly different way. So we'll have slides, and then we'll dart over to my screen to play the videos individually, which is not as we planned, but should work. This was a last-minute solution, and we will be re-recording this to send out to everybody after this event. So this is not going to be the recorded version because we have the slightly more technical difficulties. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about carbon sequestration, and CSIR, they asked me to put together a virtual field trip on this, and it actually turned out to be a very interesting project. I got to see some very interesting outcrops from around Alberta, and I'm going to be sharing them with you today. So let's just have the next slide. So first of all, why would you use a virtual field trip? So obviously a virtual field trip does not replace time spent in the field, but you don't get to experience the rocks at first hand and can't make your own observations, but it does have some really large advantages. First of all, COVID is still around, and everyone has to keep their distance, and this is the perfect way to do that. There's no need to travel, which saves a lot of time, and also it's a lot cheaper than traveling to the outcrop. As you can see from the map here, the places that we're visiting today go from the spiral tunnels, Kicking Horse Pass, we're going to Lake Louise, we're going to Grassy Lakes, Okotoks, Waterton, and to Dinosaur Park. So those localities, to run them in a field trip would take 3 or 4 days, and we're going to do them all in an hour. So that's pretty good. And so the only challenges that we really had during the filming for the videos was pretty rugged terrain, and also there was some high winds, flowing water, and there always seems to be traffic noise. So please bear with us for the slight background noises that we might be hearing when we go through the presentation. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So how do you go about sequestering carbon dioxide? Well, first of all, it's a 3-stage process. You need to separate out the carbon dioxide. You need to transport it to the location that you're going to be sequestering it, and then you have to inject the CO2 into your reservoir. And there are 4 main methods for that sequestration. The first is our focus today, which is a structural and stratigraphic trapping, where you literally find a trap where you have reservoir, seal, and hopefully no leakage, and you inject your CO2 into the reservoir. You can also have residual gas trapping, where CO2 bubbles are left trapped in the pores of the rock, as CO2 and water flow through the reservoir. You can have solubility trapping, where you inject CO2 and you hope that it dissolves into your brine within the reservoir rock. And then finally, mineral trapping, which is where you inject CO2 into the reservoir and allow it to react with minerals and other dissolved constituents to form new carbonate minerals. So that's more like forming almost a limestone, and that really locks up your carbon dioxide forever. So as we know, carbon sequestration or carbon injection has been undertaken for decades in the hydrocarbon industry, and we've been using carbon dioxide as a way to enhance our oil recovery. This was not done ever to lock up CO2 until recently, though. And one of the real reasons for that is that locking up CO2 is not cost effective right now. And with carbon credits, obviously, it will become more effective. But basically, you're not making any money out of injecting carbon dioxide into the ground. What are the risks of carbon sequestration? Well, leakage from boreholes and from non-sealer fractures within the caprock, pressure buildup in the reservoir that could result in fracturing or actually almost a natural fracking process, or even contamination of drinking water. So it's very important that you have a great seal as part of your overall reservoir play. Next slide, please. So the main requirements for CCS, and CCS is carbon capture and sequestration. We'll be using that term throughout today. So the main requirements for CCS are a thick, laterally extensive reservoir. So you've got to have somewhere to inject your gas into. You need at least 1 to 4 kilometers depth. And this is because when you inject the CO2, you try to inject it as a supercritical fluid. So more like a fluid than a gas. And this makes it much easier to inject. And without that pressure at least 1 kilometer depth, that's not going to happen. You need sufficient reservoir properties to make injection possible. So you need ideally porosity of around 5 to 7% and permeability of 10 to 50 millidarcies. You don't want it to be too porous and permeable, otherwise you're going to just push your carbon dioxide beyond the bounds of where you're confident about your seal. And you also don't want too high permeability for that reason, but you do want to be able to get it into your reservoir. And for example, the Quest project, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes, they think that their gas front, as they're injecting the gas front as it advances through the underground reservoir, is moving at about 25 to 30 meters a year. And that is really ideal. So yeah, you want good properties, but not too good. It's your Goldilocks window. You need an excellent top seal, and we'll talk about top seals and the variety of top seals that you might expect to see in the subsurface. And then obviously you want the area to be tectonically quiescent. If you start having earthquakes and creating new fractures, you could breach your caprock and then your carbon dioxide could leak out to surface. So the cost of carbon sequestration is about a 40% premium compared to doing absolutely nothing. So that's extra money. And as I said earlier, you need a grant to break even. There's no profit in this right now, but with the way that the world is moving, it's going to be very important for carbon sequestration to take place. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this map of North America, there's great CCS potential across the country. So if you, all of those dark blue areas there are areas where you've got usually very old reservoir rocks, Cambrian or even Precambrian in age, although there are some Cretaceous rocks which can also act as possible carbon sequestration targets. And you can see that, funnily enough, a lot of them really match up very well with where the oil and gas fields are, which are shown in red on here. So if we are producing hydrocarbons from these fields, then there's a great opportunity in a very local sense to re-inject a lot of the carbon dioxide that will be produced alongside your hydrocarbons. So overall, quite encouraging. Next slide, please. So this is across the globe, this is the carbon dioxide sequestration facilities, projects, and opportunities. So if you look at these projects here, you can see that to start off with, there aren't very many around the world. So large-scale facilities, there's one completed around the world. They're operating, there's around 5, and some examples include Quest, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Opportunities in Saskatchewan, they're doing it, and there's a couple in Europe as well, but really very, very limited number of projects. So we're at the forefront, we're in the early days, the nascent stages of carbon sequestration. So I can see this map being heavily populated in the years to come. I was going to put together a geological summary to show you of all the different opportunities that are going on, but there really isn't enough information and not enough published to be able to do that. But what I can tell you is that Cambrian reservoirs seem to be the main target right now. Next, please. So let's just look at one example of a project, and we're going to talk about carbon sequestration in the Quest project, which is Shell's project. And what we'll do is that we'll highlight the different factors that were important, and then we're going to go and look at those in the field. So the Quest project is located northeast of Edmonton, and it's designed to capture up to 1.2 million tons per year of carbon dioxide, and it's been operating since 2015. And the carbon dioxide is injected into the basal Cambrian sandstone, which we're abbreviating to BCS, at a depth of 2,000 to 2,100 meters. So that's nicely within our zone where we can have this superfluid carbon dioxide. And then we have a fantastic seal, the Winnipegosis, which is evaporite seals, and evaporites are excellent as seals due to their impervious qualities. The Shell staff use the GOG quartzite as an analog, and that's where we're going to be spending a lot of our time in the field today. So we think along the same lines. And what you see with these Cambrian sandstones is that around the globe, there are Cambrian transgressive deposits associated with the SAUC-2 subsequence of North America. But pretty much worldwide, wherever you see lower Cambrian rocks, they are often quartzites, and they often form thick, tidally dominated sandstone sediments. And so we'll look at those when we look at the GOG quartzite. Within the Quest project, and this is in the lower right here, you can see some logs here with the different depositional settings. And what we see is that there are fluvial influenced tide-dominated bay margin sediments, tide-dominated bay margins, proximal distal bays, and offshore deposits. But really what we find in a lot of these Cambrian deposits is that they are tide-dominated. And the results of the Quest project so far show minimal leakage. They've seen a tiny, tiny bit of leakage. So that's good in some ways because it shows that their monitoring programs are working correctly. There's no real thermal effects with changes in the heat and how that might affect fracturing and new fracturing. And there seems to be no impact of a flowing aquifer going through the reservoir interval. So all in all, it looks very positive. Next, please. So the geological properties of the basal Cambrian sandstone, it's widespread, but typically relatively thin, so less than 100 meters, and it has a sheet-like geometry. So we have a really nice sheet-like reservoir made up dominantly of tidal sands. It's very texturally and mineralogically mature, so they're nice rounded grains, and you can see in those cross the thin sections there in the lower right that we've got nice pore spaces within the reservoir and nice rounded grains. The blue represents the porosity here. And there's a lack of clay to silt-sized sediments. So a lot of the fine grain material has been was never deposited due to the weathering scenario in the Cambrian with no land plants. So there's no chance to hold up sediment and keep the sediment, make it relatively fine grained as it weathers and breaks down. And also slow subsidence rates and low shelf gradients. So all in all, these lead to a lack of fine-grained sediments. We've got these nice coarse sandstones, and we're going to see some of those in core a little bit later on as well. Okay, next, please. Just to compare modern tide-dominated systems with some as Cambrian analogues, the diagram at the top left there shows modern tide-dominated areas around the world, and you can see we've got some areas in Canada that we all know about, in Nova Scotia, around Britain, where there's some incredible tides up to 13 to 15 meters high as well, and then there's other areas around the world that are tide-dominated. And when you look at the kind of deposits that are being deposited in association with these high tides, we can see a lot of sand ridges, and the top right there, we can see some very nice examples from the North Sea, which is full of sand ridges and sand wave fields. The sand wave fields are shown in brown, and the sand ridges are the lines. Then we've got also sand waves in places like San Francisco Bay, but there are lots of places around the world where we've got modern analogues to learn from. And there's also some other ancient analogues. I've just put in one diagram here from good old Leighton Buzzard in the UK, which is probably about 60 or 70 miles north of London. And you can see that we've got these really nice Cretaceous sand waves here, which actually form a potential reservoir up to 60 to 70 meters in thickness, so pretty much pure sandstone. Next, please. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of Cambrian deposits around the world. So probably the nicest analog, and unfortunately there wasn't quite enough money in the budget to fly to Table Mountain to go and have a look at the sediments there, because that would have been a beautiful addition to our field trip, because Table Mountain is made of Cambrian clastic sediments and stacked sandstone. So the Table Mountain Formation is pretty much a perfect analog to the basal Cambrian sandstone here in Alberta. We've also got very similar deposits in China, and you can see this top right here, we've actually got Precambrian gneisses at the base of this section, and then passing up into some nice quartzites as well. And we're going to see exactly that same succession in the Deadwood Formation when we look at the core. We've got examples from France as well, and then down at the bottom here we've got the famous pipe rock from northern Scotland, and this is another Cambrian example of nice tidal sandstones. Okay, next slide please. So let's VFT, so that's a virtual field trip, and this is where we have to keep our fingers crossed that that this is all going to work nicely. So can everyone see this screen here?
Yep.
One of the factors that's very important for carbon sequestration is to have a reservoir that is laterally extensive, possibly even regionally extensive. And in clastic settings, there are two environments where you can pretty much guarantee to see that have the chance of extensive sand sheets. One of these is in a shallow marine setting where you have longshore drift, and as long as your coast is, that's how big your sand body can be. And that also can extend out into even turbidite deposits can also be extensive. However, fluvial deposits can also form successful carbon sequestration reservoirs. And the way that that's possible, if we look at this example here, we have a floodplain sitting in here with a single channel flowing across it. So the channel's flowing across, and we can see that what will happen is that that channel, which is marked in orange there, will be encased in mudstones. So that would be a good place to store a small amount of gas, but obviously you want a sandstone bed that's more extensive than that. So what happens is that if you lower sea level and you have a low stand of sea level, then what will happen is that at that low stand position where you're not changing relative sea level, the channel can cut through at successive places while it's migrating or changing course over time. So as it avulses, so as it moves from here to here to here through time, what it will do is that it will keep cutting through at the same stratigraphic elevation. So you'll gradually build up a sand sheet. Now we're here in Dinosaur Park, and we have a fantastic example of that in the Comray sandstone. So this is the outcrop of the Comray sandstone. And what you can see here is about 5 or 6 meters of sandstone, which is a sheet sandstone. And unbelievably, this sandstone extends for around 200 kilometers across the country. And this is a perfect example of where we've had a low stand situation, fall in relative sea level, and the channel is cut through at the same position again and again and again. If we look at the sedimentary structures within the channel, and particularly over here on the left side of the outcrop, we can see that there are trough cross beds within there, because this is a relatively low sinuosity system. So rather than being dominated by point bars, it's dominated by sand dunes. So if we were to inject carbon dioxide into this reservoir, then that carbon dioxide could stretch out for the entire 200 kilometers, assuming that there was no sandstone over the top of this, leading to juxtaposition. Come to Dinosaur Park, and we're looking at what happens when you have two sandstones interacting with one another. So at this outcrop, we have low sinuosity channel underneath, separated by an ironstone layer with 400,000 years of missing section, and then overlain by high sinuosity fluvial deposits above. So this is the Old Man Formation down here and the Dinosaur Park Formation here. And what we're seeing is what's called juxtaposition. So we're juxtaposing two sand bodies against one another. And what this means for oil and gas or for carbon sequestration is that if you start injecting or trying to produce from these intervals, what you're going to do is you're going to see an interaction between the two sandstones. So if we're trying to inject carbon dioxide into this low sinuosity, thick sandstone here, and an example of that would be the Comray sandstone, then what's going to happen is that very easily that carbon dioxide can start working its way up into the overlying sandstone and even pass up into younger units if it hasn't got a sufficient seal. So it's very important to get an idea of the juxtaposition between your sand bodies, your fluvial sand bodies, before you start injecting carbon dioxide into them.
So what you need is a laterally extensive reservoir. And in terms of clastics, we'll come to carbonates later, but in terms of clastics, they fall into two categories. Fluvial ones that we talked about already. So fluvial deposits, you can either have the situation that I described when you have a laterally extensive sand sheet that's made up by repeated channels coming through at the same stratigraphic elevation, or you can have a meandering system where your system's meandering backwards and forwards. And we've got some examples here from the Mississippi River Channel Belt. So that would give you a nice wide belt and would also make a nice carbon sequestration target if it was in the fossil record. Then the other scenario is to have shore face deposits. And that's what we were talking about from the Quest project. And this is where you have coarsening upward successions, which are shown on the right here as a sketch from more muddy deposits passing up into more sandy deposits. And in fact, what's happened in the Cambrian is that you had pretty much all sandy deposits. So you had thicknesses up to 300 meters of tidal sandstones. And in fact, the gold quartzite, which is dominated by sandstone, can be up to 2 kilometers in thickness. So that makes a fantastic reservoir target for the CCS. The sands are deposited usually paralleling the coast, and they extend offshore with these very low gradients, and then the sands are reworked due to longshore drift. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to play the next video here.
This is the Grinnell Formation. It's 1.45 billion years old, and it was deposited in a large basin as part of a succession that's about 7 kilometers in thickness. So the basin was subsiding somewhere just to the south of the equator back in that time, all those billions of years ago, and it was filling up with sediments. And the sediments here in the Grinnell Formation are tidal deposits. If you look at them, you can see that they're bright red in color with white interbeds, and this is probably due to changes in the water table that have created the white bleaching, and the rest of the time the red staining is due to hematite. We can also see in these rocks ripples and desiccation cracks, which help to confirm that this was a tidal flat deposit. In terms of carbon sequestration, this basin stretched for at least 200 or 300 kilometers. And the rocks are Precambrian in age. So first of all, in most parts of the basin, they're still going to be deeply buried, which is great for carbon sequestration. You need it really to be at least 1 kilometers to 4 kilometers in depth to make sure that you keep the carbon dioxide in a supercritical state. And then these rocks are thick, so the Grinnell Formation is up to 200 or 300 meters in thickness. And then finally, because it's a mudstone, it's not porous, so that means that it acts as a very good seal or cap rock.
So yeah, so that I should have mentioned that the Grinnell Formation is actually from Waterton and Waterton National Park. So there's some fantastic geology there. Everyone goes for the beautiful scenery, but the geology is amazing as well. And I've just put in these examples of some of the tidal indicators that we're seeing within this formation, so we can be confident that it's tidal. So some of the features that you see in there are these really fantastic desiccation cracks, which are shown in the top right and the center. We also have nice wave rippling here, which you can see on the left there, and the lower left diagram, you can actually see a cross section there which shows you that these ripples are symmetrical, and that the symmetrical ripples are formed by wave action. So they're formed by action moving backwards and forwards, as opposed to current ripples, which are formed by a unidirectional flow and have an asymmetric profile. And then another really fantastic feature is that these pseudomorphs after halite at the lower right here. And what's happening here is that you've had very shallow tidal flats, and then the tidal flats have actually dried out And as they've dried out, the water that's there, because it's seawater, is saline in character. And so it's actually deposited these salt crystals. And the salt crystals are resting on the mudstone. And eventually more water has come in and has washed them out. But then the sediment has filled in and left these pseudomorphs after halite. So hopefully you can see that these have a kind of cubic form, and we're looking at the corners of halite crystals. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're going to turn to the GOG quartzite. And we mentioned earlier that this is a great analog for the Quest basal Cambrian sandstone. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through and have a look at a whole series of videos here, one by one. And those will help us to get a feel for this classic analog for CCS, but I actually also believe that the GOG quartzite can be a carbon sequestration target in its own right. So let's go ahead and show some of the videos here. So we're going to show a few videos, and they're all about the GOG quartzite. And I think most of you will recognize where this first one is. This is my daughter, who's actually done all of the filming for the videos. And this is her climbing up at Okotoks.
Hi, we're at Okotoks, just to the south of Calgary, and we've come here to look at what was once described as the world's largest glacial erratic, although that turned out later not to be true. And the rocks behind me that you can see here, they are Cambrian in age, so they're around 500 million years old. And they were deposited in a shallow marine sea somewhere in the region that is now Jasper. So if we look at our map here, here's Jasper up here, and here's Calgary here. This is the outline of Alberta. So what happened was these rocks were deposited, and then they were buried quite deeply, several kilometers down, and the sandstone was metamorphosed into quartzites. And so they're very, very hard. And these quartzites were there in the subsurface, and then around 50 to 80 million years ago, they were uplifted to the surface, and they formed Mount Edith Cavell and several other mountains in the area around Jasper. So all was well until glacial times, when a massive set of glaciers were making their way southward from the Arctic Circle and moving down towards the south. And there was a giant landslide in the Mount Edith Cavell area. And that landslide led to a load of quartzite being deposited onto the surface of the glaciers. So if we look at our map here, I'll just come around above it here. This is Jasper. So what happened was the landslide deposited all this quartzite material on the surface of the glacier, and then the glacier initially moved towards the west, and then the Cordilleran glaciers interacted with the Laurentide glaciers, and they moved southward. And as they moved southward, they deposited quartzite block after quartzite block, forming what's called the foothills erratic train. And these blocks here are just two of thousands and thousands of these quartzite blocks. And the quartzite blocks stretch 930 kilometers from Jasper all the way down into Montana. We've come to Kicking Horse Pass to look at outcrops of the GOG quartzite. And unfortunately it's a little bit noisy here. We're on Highway 1, but nonetheless the outcrops are excellent. Why are we looking at the GOG quartzite? Well, it's early Cambrian in age, and it forms a great analog and a possible target for carbon sequestration. We've seen other projects using Cambrian quartzites, such as Shell's Quest project, which is using the basal Cambrian quartzite, and also in Saskatchewan, where they're using the Deadwood Formation. The GOG quartzite here is around 2 kilometers in thickness, of which at least 600 meters are exposed, and it's dominated by sandstones. It was deposited along a passive margin on the western coast of Laurentia, and most of the depositional settings we see here are either tidal or shallow marine in character. The overall net to gross is typically very high, and overall this forms a great chance for us to see one of the classic potential reservoirs for carbon sequestration.
So now we're going to move on to look at some of the sedimentary structures that you see within the GOG quartzite.
So we're looking at a road cut on Highway 1, close to Sink Lake, and you can see that there's a fantastic succession here of gold quartzite, at least 70 or 80 meters in stratigraphic thickness. And we're going to start off by looking at the structural features, and if I just home in on this area here, you can see a series of subvertical fractures dipping slightly to the east, and most of these fractures are open, but there are also some sealed fractures, and I'm just going to home in here on one of those. So if we come down here, you can see these two features here dipping down towards the east again, and both of these have been cemented up by quartz. So that's the structural side, and that would obviously have an impact on carbon sequestration, because these through-growing fractures, and I can see them stretching up the outcrop, are obviously going to affect your ability to store carbon dioxide. In terms of sedimentology, if we look at the section here, you can see three interbedded thinner shales, black shales, and these shales are pelagic shales, so they would have been deposited in very quiet conditions, and then they are interbedded with some really beautiful quartzites, and the quartzites show some great sedimentary structures. And if we look at this bed up here, which is around 1 meter in thickness, we can see these nice trough crossbeds in there, and the trough crossbeds were formed by dunes, and most likely these dunes were deposited by longshore drift currents. So we had a north-south trending coastline, and the dunes would be migrating towards the north along that coastline, and the dip at the beds shows us the original orientation of these crossbeds. So in terms of porosity, these quartzites are around 5 to 7%, and that's really perfect for carbon sequestration. So you've got the chance to introduce your supercritical carbon dioxide, and without it having to then escape too quickly from the individual beds. When you imagine a coastline, you would think that the longshore drift would go in one direction, and in this case with the north-south coastline, it'll be running from south towards the north. However, what we see here is this lower quartzite has trough crossbeds dipping down towards the west. But when we look at the quartzite situated just above it, we see a change in crossbed direction, and now the crossbeds are dipping down towards the east in the direction that I'm passing the camera. Now, it's unlikely there'd be a 180-degree switch in paleocurrent direction, and this is much more likely to be due to subtle variations in the seabed topography through time. But it also demonstrates why you have to be quite careful when you're using trough crossbed data to remember that just because the trough crossbeds dip in one direction, that doesn't necessarily signify that the longshore drift ran in that direction at all times. One of the dominant sedimentary structures that we've observed in the gold quartzite was trough crossbedding, and we interpreted that as longshore drift in a marine setting. So how do we know that it's a marine setting? Well, I've come here to Lake Louise, and I'm standing on a point bar next to the Bow River. You can see there's lots of big clasts sitting here, and I've just collected one of these clasts to show you my evidence for why this is a marine deposit. If we look at this piece of quartzite that I have here, you can see that it's full of marine burrows. I'm just putting my finger there to show you how big they are, and you can see that there's lots of these vertical burrows. And if we look at the top surface of this, just step back here, we can see that there's lots and lots of these burrows. And if you look carefully, you can see that a lot of them are actually paired. So for example, this one here, those two burrows there are paired. And what that shows us is that this is not scolithos, which is individual burrows, but that these are lugworm burrows, and they are made by a U-shaped burrow created by a lugworm, and they are definite clincher indicators that we are in a marine setting.
Look at energy levels, changing energy levels now.
So we can see some changing energy levels through these sediments. We have a nice trough cross-bedded quartzite at the base here. And then we can see that it passes up into these rippled sediments. These ripple sediments are much more thinly laminated. And we can see that each ripple package there is probably only about 5 to 10 centimeters in thickness. You can see a beautiful rippled surface in here picked out by this cementation, this dark colored cementation. And these ripples here are symmetrical, so these are wave ripples, which also shows us that we're still in a shallow marine environment, but just in a quieter time period. And those ripple deposits carry on up for around 2 meters before we have our next trough cross-bedded package coming back in again. The more you look at these sediments, the more there is to see. And we're focusing in on one particular bed here within this overall quartzite succession. And this bed that I'm focusing in on now has suffered dewatering. So it was presumably deposited fairly rapidly. And there was a lot of water that was trapped in the sediments. And then as the sediments were compressed through time, that water had to escape somehow and it forced its way upwards, leading to these contorted beds. And each of these structures here that I'm focusing in on is like a little smile, and the fluids would have escaped between each of these structures. You can see this one here. I'll put my finger on it for scale. And you can see that that structure is probably around 1 meter in width, and the water would have been escaping at either end of this structure.
So next we're going to look at some of the bigger picture within these sediments.
We can see some striking changes in the thickness of the sandstone beds as you go through this part of the section as spiral tunnels. In the lower portion here we have thinner beds, and these thicken up. And this could either be in response to changes in relative sea level or possibly changes in subsidence rate, with this thinner beds representing less accommodation space and the thicker beds representing more accommodation space through time. So what do these changes in relative thickness mean as far as carbon sequestration goes? Well, I don't think they really have a big impact. You're still going to be injecting into sandstones, they're still porous, and in fact the thinner sandstones will be less laterally persistent, so maybe better for storing carbon dioxide. And in addition, these do provide a great way of correlating between your reservoirs over distances. Looking at the section here in spiral tunnels, we can see that it's a very high net to gross, so there's not much shale in here, and that means that there's lots of reservoir to store your carbon dioxide, which is great. Although it has to be said that internal seals, so thin interbedded mudstones, can also be very helpful in terms of trapping your carbon dioxide. However, what's most important is that top seal, and for that you want something like an evaporite to give you the best seal.
Okay, next we're going to look at CCS reservoirs in core. So we can have the next slide, please, Stephanie. So I did a study this year on the Deadwood Formation, which I'm just going to share a couple of slides with you. So the Deadwood Formation is an early Cambrian analog to the BCS, and it's a multi-purpose reservoir. It's produced oil and gas in North Dakota, helium in Saskatchewan. It's being used for a big carbon sequestration project in Saskatchewan. It's an aquifer, and it's even yielded gold as well. And it's being considered as a possible geothermal target. So this really is your multi-purpose reservoir. It's the Swiss Army knife of Cambrian deposits. So the Aquisor site for carbon dioxide in Saskatchewan has stored over 430,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So it's a relatively small project, but successful project. And the ice box member shales of the Winnipeg Formation form the top seal. And you can see in this diagram here in the lower right what the succession looks like, with around 700 meters of section shown here, with the prairie evaporite as the seal, reservoir caprock as the shale, and then the reservoir itself is this Deadwood Formation. And the Deadwood is very good for injection because it's thick in the first place. It averages 7 to 9% porosity and up to 20 millidarcies of permeability, and it has excellent top seals, and there's very low seismic risk as well. If I can have the next slide. So this is just 4 selected cores from Alberta, And if we look at those cores one by one, on the right-hand side there, we have a core which actually goes through into basement, which is always exciting to see a cored basement in Alberta. And so what we see is a gneiss there at the base, overlain by a kind of weathered soil, which would be the reworked gneiss, and then passing up into alluvial fan channels. Then we start moving a bit more distally. So we're moving out onto the tidal flats in core B. And we can see tidal flat deposits here, which comprise mudstones, wavy laminated sandstones, and some really amazing flat pebble conglomerates, which if anyone's interested, I have lots of photographs of those. I'll show you one a little bit later, but very, very unusual looking deposit. And then this particular core is capped by a dolomite. So that would be your top seal. And that dolomite is Ordovician in age. Then we move into core D here, which is shoreface succession with shoreface parasequences. We've got cyclic deposits passing up from muds to wavy laminated sandstones to trough cross-bedded sandstone. So pretty classic parasequences. And then finally, we go out into embayment deposits, my interpreted embayment deposits with a little bit of tidal flats at the base in core C, and then capped by an embayment with limited circulation with a lot of pyrite in there, and wavy laminated sediments. And once again, that's capped by a dolomite. So next slide, please. So this is just what the cores look like themselves. So each of the cores here is around 12 to 15 meters in thickness. And I mean, it was a bargain offer here. I went to the core store. It cost about $200 to pull these 4 cores in half a day and to interpret them. And you end up with a data set that you can use for CCS projects. Just to point out there, that bottom right core with the igneous deposits at the base there with the gneiss overlain by the soils and then the trough cross beds. And then probably the core C there at top left is important to look at as well, because that would be your main sequestration target. And you can see the shales that I picked out in there that with the symbol SH, and they mark your internal seals, which are very useful in helping to control your injectivity. Next slide, please. So this is just to show you a reconstruction. So this is my model with the hinterland there towards the top left, made up of gneisses and igneous rocks. And then these are being weathered out. So you've got an alluvial fan deposit there, which we saw at the top of core A in red. And then tidal flat deposits. And you can't really see it very well, but the flat pebble conglomerate would be in there. So that's reworked muds that have dried out and then been rolled in very shallow tidal flat settings. And there's breccia deposits in there as well. And then we pass out into those yellow deposits, which are slightly more distal with longshore drift and parasequences. And those would be your main target for injectivity. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're going to look at the other side of the coin and look at some carbonate reservoirs. And I'm just going to share my screen here.
So we've talked about how clastic reservoirs can make good carbon sequestration targets, but they need to be laterally extensive. And the same is true for carbonates. Carbonates have the similar porosities to Cambrian sandstones, so maybe around 6 to 7%. And this allows carbon dioxide to flow through the carbonates, but in a controlled manner, which means that they won't suddenly appear at surface. So if we look at this particular rock here, this is a Precambrian stromatolite. So this is from the Waterton area, from the Saye formation. And we can see these really interesting layers that are being formed. And the way that this stromatolitic limestone is being formed is that we have growth of blue-green algae on a very shallow seabed. And that algae is quite mucus and quite sticky. So then sediment is washed across, and that's the grey parts of this succession. And the sediment sticks to the algae, and gradually, and then the algae grows through the sediment and grows and forms another mucus layer. Then the sediment builds up, and you end up with this succession of layers forming this bed of stromatolites. Now, if you have a very shallow marine carbonate that's stretching for maybe 50 or 60 kilometers as a platform, then that will form a layer of limestones, and those limestones could be up to maybe 500 or 600 meters in thickness. And this makes an ideal target for carbon sequestration. And the only other thing that you need is a seal. And we're going to look at seals in argillites or mudstones that form the interbeds with these limestones.
So obviously there are many other carbonates. That was just one example from Waterton, from the Saye Formation. And there was a nice presentation at the core conference this year about the Banff limestone being used for water disposal, but that was equally, it could be used for carbon dioxide disposal as well. And other limestones like the Keg River limestones have been used for disposal. And there's plenty of limestones in the Moose Mountain area, which are buried to 2 kilometers or more. So we should not just restrict ourselves to Cambrian clastics, but we should consider the carbonates as potential storage media as well. And I just put in this picture from Grassy Lakes here, because Grassy Lakes has Devonian carbonates and they have fantastic porosity. And as long as you have enough permeability to go with that porosity, then that would make a great seal as well. I do have a video for that, but I'm not going to be showing it now, but I will add it, we'll add it into the final presentation. So we're now going to move on to look at structure and the impacts of fractures and faults on carbon sequestration.
When we look at this outcrop, we can see the difficulties in trying to model the fracture systems when working on carbon sequestration. Here we have some nice vertical fractures running approximately north-south, and most of these fractures appear to be open, certainly in outcrop. But then as we move across the face and we look at this brown bed sitting in here, we can see that we have some north-south oriented fractures, but we also have some which are oriented northwest-southeast. And these fractures appear to be mineralized and possibly cemented as well. So that's 2 sets of fractures. Stepping a little further across the outcrop, we have this through-going vertical fracture here, and that fracture is oriented northeast-southwest. So it appears that we've got at least 2 sets of conjugate fractures which are running through here, and all of this contributes to the complexity of the structure within Cambrian deposits. And this is very typical. Cambrian sediments have been around for a long time, 520 million years, and they've had plenty of time in which to be tectonically altered.
So the GOG does have some structures in it. It all looks very well behaved in the outcrops that we looked at from Kicking Horse Pass. But as you're looking at the outcrops in spiral tunnels and those outcrops that we looked at for the net to gross, you can see that there's also a lot of structuration in here, or tectonic activity, and that this is just one beautiful fold that I came across towards the top of that spiral tunnels outcrop. So that outcrop is just as you go into BC along Highway 1. So you can see this heavy folding in here. And when you look at any of the outcrops, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of chance of fractures as well. So why do we care about that? Well, let's have a look at the next slide. So what are the consequences of carbon dioxide leakage? And I've taken this example, which is really something quite different and not something from North America, but Lake Nyos in Cameroon. And Lake Nyos erupted in 1986, and it was what's called a limnic eruption. And a limnic eruption is where you have a kind of like an overturn of water. And what happened was that the water in the lake was overturned by the pressure of carbon dioxide that had built up beneath it. And the possible causes for that overturning of the water column were maybe a small volcanic eruption, maybe a landslide, or even cool rainfall, because if you had cool water at one end of the lake, then the change in density can actually cause overturning as well. And the carbon dioxide escaped from the lake. This is showing it here in the lower right. You can see that purple area there at the base of the crater lake. And it escaped, and then a river of carbon dioxide around 50 meters thick flowed down the sides of the volcano and ended up killing 1,700 people, 3,500 livestock, and it was that plume of carbon dioxide extended for 23 kilometers. So while we live with carbon dioxide and live and breathe carbon dioxide all the time, it just shows that when you have a concentration of carbon dioxide, which would be quite possible if you were to rupture a carbon sequestration target, that you could create a really deadly effect from that. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to look at seals, and I've got a couple of videos to show you.
There are 2 key factors. You need to share, Joe.
Oh, sorry.
There are two key factors that you require to make a successful carbon sequestration project. One of those is a regionally extensive sheet sandstone or sheet of limestone that you can inject into. And the other key factor is to have a caprock that's impervious to the carbon dioxide. And at this outcrop, we're going to look at a succession that starts off with an ironstone, capped by a 2 to 3 meter thick sandstone. And then over the top of that, we have around 10 to 15 meters of mudstone. So when you look at that mudstone, you can see that it is made up of different layers, but basically it's all mudstone within there. So there's no passage for the carbon dioxide to escape. So this interval here would be a successful caprock. We're here at Red Rock Canyon in Waterton, and the sediments directly behind me are from the Grinnell Formation, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in a moment. They're terrestrial mudstones, and as you can see, they're a very bright red color, and this red color is due to hematite. And it's striking to realize that the hematite color, this coloration, this red color, is actually due to iron that may be as low as 3%. So a low iron concentration is giving a very strong color. If we pan around towards the left there, you can see that the color changes to this pale green. And the pale green is there because of chlorite within the rocks. And the reason that we have this change in color from red to green is because of metamorphism. So what's happened is that these red rocks have been colored green because they've been cooked up. So what's cooked them? What's cooked them is the Purcell sill. And if we pan around further to the left there, you can see these dark grey rocks, which are actually gabbros. So they're an igneous rock, a magma originally that's been intruded. So it was intruded at high pressure between the sedimentary layers and formed a sill. So why are we interested in this sill? Well, the sill provides a caprock. So this will be a nice caprock. If you were injecting carbon dioxide into these sediments, then you need an impervious sill, and an igneous rock has much lower permeability than any sedimentary rock. So we're back with the Purcell sill here. This is the sill. It's a gabbro, and as we've talked about, the sill forms an excellent caprock in terms of trying to inject carbon dioxide into these rocks. Now, there are some negatives, so we can see that the sill is quite fractured in this area, but the thickness of the sill at around 60 meters is easily enough to contain carbon dioxide beneath it. This is one example of a sill from here in Waterton, but there are many other sills around the world which will also form great caprocks for carbon sequestration. And some examples are the Great Wind Sill in the UK, and sills, dolerite sills that occur within the Karoo deposits in South Africa. So certainly worth considering as a potential caprock.
Just ranking the seals, the best seals are thick evaporites, such as the Winnipegosis. So we have some great seals here in Western Canada, which is very good. Totally impervious, and they're even somewhat mobile, so they can heal any developing faults and fractures. And I've got some examples here of potash from the Allen potash mine in Saskatchewan on the top right there. Basalt outflows can form great seals, but they're quite rare, and sills are good too. And that middle diagram there, it's not the best photograph in the world, but what's happening here is that you've got sand dunes, aeolian sand dunes, in fact, they were deposited in the Cretaceous, and then they've been capped by basalt outflows. And this is happening while the Atlantic was opening. This is from Namibia. And so we're seeing the basalt forming a really nice seal there, and that would work as a carbon sequestration target as well. And then mudstones is usually what we have to work with. And you just have to, when you look at the diagrams that I've shown here, you can see that the properties of the mudstones in terms of porosity and permeability decrease as you go down deeper into the sediments, and you don't want to go down too deep, otherwise your permeability gets to a level where you can't inject anything anymore. So you've got to find that 2 to 4 kilometer depth really to get the best results. Okay, if we can have the next slide, please. So we're just going to wrap up. So next slide. So just in summary, successful carbon sequestration requires a thick, laterally extensive reservoir, burial depth to 1 to 4 kilometers to ensure that the carbon dioxide is supercritical, making it easier to inject. Good, but not too good, porosity and permeabilities. An excellent top seal, and you ideally want areas that are tectonically quiescent. And the best targets in North America appear to be Cambrian sandstones and quartzites, and also some of our older carbonate platforms. And I believe that there's a lot to learn from outcrop studies, and this was demonstrated by the Quest project. But make sure that you get out into the field and you've got those glacial erratics from the gold quartzite here in Calgary. So it's not like you have to go very far if you live in the city. So I'm going to finish there. I've got one thank you slide, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, that was great information, John. And we do have some questions. So I will start and ask as they come in. Please feel free, everyone who is listening in, to continue to post questions into the Q&A, but we will start with asking some that we've already received. So John, to begin, you mentioned that Lower Cambrian quartzites appear to be a potential global target for CCS. So can you provide some thoughts on such old and in some cases formations that have been buried relatively deeply at some point in their history, how they have maintained the porosity and permeability needed to be CCS targets? And particularly when you show some of the outcrop photos and videos of the GOG formation and other equivalents, you know, what we seem to see are fairly well cemented. So why is that we're seeing those in those comparisons, and what is it that allows such old formations at depth to maintain the porosity and permeability?
Yeah, a good question. So first of all, there definitely are some of these rocks so glassy and so cemented up by remobilized quartz that they would not make good targets. But it seems when you look at these tidal rocks, for a start, we have no fines in there, so they're all just beautifully kind of like the orange stacking with the equisized grains, nicely rounded. So as long as they haven't been cemented up after burial, or even if they've been cooked to some extent by metamorphism, then they're still going to have enough porosity. And definitely, when I looked at some of the data from Table Mountain Formation, the data from the GOG and the data from the basal Cambrian sandstones, and there seems to be a kind of pretty classic, typical sort of 5 to 7% porosity within them. So my interpretation is that the quartz is harder to remobilize anyway. So maybe if they haven't been metamorphosed too much, you haven't remobilized the quartz that's cemented up all of the pore space within these rocks. So yeah, I think it's the shallow marine, really excellent sorting that probably makes them the best reservoirs, or the reservoirs that they are, and still capable of poroperm readings that are good for sequestration.
That's great information again. So let's take that the next step is, if you definitely had focused, and there seems to be more of a focus on siliciclastic reservoirs, but if we had a carbonate reservoir and a clastic reservoir, each with similar porosity, each with similar permeability, is one preferable to the other for CCS?
I had not considered that. I would say let's go for both. But yeah, pretty typically they've been following these Cambrian sandstones because they are so regionally extensive. You know, the Deadwood Formation extends all the way from South Dakota into Alberta, and it's pretty much continuous in terms of being a sandstone or a quartzite over that whole interval. But we do have some very extensive carbonate reservoirs. It's just a lot of them are kind of, the reason we see them is because they're all exposed in the Rockies. But you get out into the foothills area and going out, for instance, around Drumheller, you drill down and those carbonates are all there. My friend Murray, who was the carbonate geologist at Husky, he found that his job changed from looking for oil and gas to looking for sequestration, and not necessarily for carbon dioxide, but for water, brines, sulfur dioxide. There's lots of opportunities for storage in carbonates as well. So I think here in Alberta, we're lucky that we have two opportunities, two options. And I would suggest, at the end of the day, if we can use both of them, then that will give the oil sands a long lease of life as well, where we can still guarantee to store all of the carbon dioxide that's being produced.
Excellent. Another comment that you had made was the idea that shale interbeds within a reservoir might be a benefit. So there might be some effective support for internal sealing. At what point do those shale interbeds go from being supportive to jeopardizing the quality of a CCS reservoir?
Yeah, so we haven't really seen that very much in these Cambrian deposits because they are so sand prone. And you saw that the outcrop that I showed from Kicking Horse Pass, we've just got those little thin interbeds of mudstone, so not a great deal of mudstone. We always worked, when I was at Husky, we always considered that about 1.5 meters was, if you get thicker than that in mudstones, then there's no chance of them being breached, pretty much, even if you have got somewhat overpressured reservoirs. But I don't think we really see that. So at the moment, we're really looking more at tanks within the Cambrian deposits. But I do think that any kind of baffle is just going to help to kind of localize your pockets and your individual reservoir tanks, so that they're not all necessarily in communication with each other. Because if they're all in communication, you only need one small breach and it could really be quite catastrophic.
And because of that, maybe this next question you have already somewhat answered, but do you think the consideration of hydraulic fracturing will ever be part of augmenting the natural reservoir quality of a CCS target? Or are we going to stay focused on natural porosity and permeability for long-term success?
Yeah, I in a kind of ideal world, 100 years from now, where carbon dioxide is a sin to even have any carbon dioxide in the air, then that might happen. But the real problem that I did allude to briefly is the cost of all of this. And when you add fracking on top of the cost of already injecting, I just think that they would rather, for now, try and find the reservoirs which work naturally. And we're lucky that we do have a few of those around. I just was looking at the questions here, Colleen. I was going to address that question from the Quest project.
Well, I just have a couple.
Oh, okay.
More general Quest, and then jump into Quest, because I've got a couple for Quest. But in the idea of mineralization as a method of carbon sequestration, can you provide a bit more detail regarding what takes place at depth to result in the mineralization, and how the process of that doesn't jeopardize the porosity and permeability quality that you need for the reservoir to be successful in the life cycle of CCS?
I think the short answer is no. So I have quite a few references to the mineralization and what goes on with that process, but it's definitely quite complicated, and you need to really get your geochemistry just right. So there are opportunities. Yeah, I am not sure how they avoid just immediately cementing up the reservoir with these new carbon dioxide related deposits. But there seems to be some success, but it's, once again, I think it's fairly limited areas, and that's why the strats and structural traps are what people are mainly targeting with carbon sequestration. So I think it's something that is wonderful when it works, but there are limited opportunities where it really works. But yeah, I've got probably 5 or 6 good references if anybody's interested to, which are purely all about the mineralization, and there's pages of complicated equations and diagrams which are beyond my remit really as a geologist, but that for people who are experts in that field, there's a lot of very useful data out there.
You also talked about the importance of the seal. So does the seal need to sit directly on top of the CCS target, or can it be further up stratigraphically within the column?
Yeah, so that one I can answer. So yes, it can be further up as long as you have that seal. My sort of ideal, I've always looked at Iran, and Iran has these big reservoirs, and they're producing a lot of carbon dioxide. In fact, if you go to some areas of Iran, you can't even see the sky because they're flaring everything and just burning it all off, and there's smoke everywhere, and obviously a lot of carbon dioxide associated with that. But they have the Fars evaporite, which is 700 meters thick evaporite formation, and that can occur pretty close to surface, and there's quite a lot of clastic deposits between that and the reservoir intervals. So if they were planning on re-injecting the carbon dioxide back into the reservoir, it could still leak through all of those intervening Paleocene sandstones, but then it would still be held up against the Fars evaporite, which is that upper Cainozoic in age. So yeah, it doesn't have to be immediately above your reservoir. And we also saw in that example from Saskatchewan that you have a cap, and you have the kind of like the main seal, and the cap rock and the main seal are separate. So there is a cap rock which it mainly has integrity, but then above that you have the Winnipegosis as your kind of backup, which is your main seal.
Right. So now we'll step into some more specific questions. Let's talk first around Quest. So the idea of minimal leakage, what can you say about that and to elaborate on that? And is that understood from a geomechanical perspective? Yeah,
so the Quest project, what you find with a lot of these projects is very hard to find anything online, but if you look carefully online, there's the whole Shell report on their 3D modeling is available in the public domain. So I was able to get hold of that, and it's I think 400 or 500 page document, but in there they detail everything that was done. And one of the things that they talk about is that they've actually been able to measure what's going on with that the subtle leakage, and the leakage percentage is absolutely tiny. I mean, it's barely discernible, but they do have actual physical data on that in this report. So if anyone's interested, I can share that report myself, or if you look online and do a search on Quest and I think 3D modeling, then you can actually find that report for yourself, and it's got an enormous amount of data on the sedimentary systems, on the rock properties, and on all of the kind of testing that they've done while in the early days, the first 2 years of the project. So it's a fantastic resource. And, you know, that obviously when we can't do all of this work ourselves, so it's great that it's out there and published and available.
The idea of Quest, obviously, it's a pilot project. It's not currently a full-scale, large-scale CCS project. Is there any of the geological data that you've seen through that would suggest that Quest couldn't be scaled up, or the area of Quest couldn't be scaled up into a full-scale, full-blown CCS opportunity?
I think it's really a robust project, and the thing that struck me is that knowing that they're testing this front, the advancing front of the carbon dioxide as they're injecting, and that they can map out the front, and they've got an area that's 50 by 50 kilometers, and the front is moving forward at 30 meters per year, and they're getting almost no leakage. So they have an enormous volume of reservoir that they're able to inject into. So I think from that point of view, it suggests that there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to scale up the project. And I'm peripherally involved in the Pathways project as well, where they're going to be taking a lot of carbon dioxide from the oil sands and pipelining it 600 kilometers to the south to do more carbon sequestration as well. And that project is going to be at a real kind of global scale, a large scale project. So we will get to see the proof of the pudding when Pathways comes in. And it will be a while before the pipeline's installed, but that should be a really interesting project to follow.
In terms of maybe some of the work that's being done either through academia or industry, do you have an idea of a standardized relative perm test so with liquid CO2 and in caprock that is considered reliable at this point?
Okay, no, I don't know of that. I see a CSER would like to answer the question live. So, did they mean me or do they mean CSER? I'm not sure about the rel perm tests that would need to be done. I'm sorry, but maybe there's somebody out there who's more on the reservoir engineering side who'd be able to answer that question.
Great. And just since again, for everyone, if there's any additional questions to ask of John, feel free to post them. But one last question, maybe in a general sense, to what's happening in Alberta with the government proposals, and you've already mentioned Pathways. Have you been surprised at what the government's going, the scale of what's happening, or completely unsurprised at how quickly there's interest and progress and government support within Alberta and CCS?
Well, that's a bit of a politically loaded question.
Not from a political perspective, from a technical perspective.
People would say that the Liberal government's got a total downer on Alberta while suctioning off all the money they can from the province. Some people would say that. But yeah, it has surprised me. But I think that things like CCS and I think that's a much more likely success path in terms of reducing our emissions than a lot of these green energy projects, which they're very intensive in terms of the energy that they take to construct the equipment just to collect the energy, like wind farms and solar panel farms. That I don't really feel that the way that they're measured is a true representation of how much emissions they're taking out of the system. So I think that carbon sequestration is a far better way of reducing our carbon dioxide emissions. So it's good that there is support for these, and I think that's recognized by companies like CNRL and the big companies who are investing in Pathways and projects like that, is that this is really one of the ways forward. Well, we're not going to get away from hydrocarbons for the next 50 years, I can guarantee that. So it's very important that we have a way to mitigate some of the emissions, and this is a good way of doing it.
Well, as far as I can see, you've made it through the gauntlet of the questions. So thank you again, John, very much for your talk and for responding to the questions. And I'm not sure, Al, if you sign us off.
Oh, I sure will. Thank you so much. Great dialogue, you guys. Great questions, and thank you once again to our presenter John for an exceptional tour. It's amazing. We can overcome challenges even at the last minute. So I think it went really well. Trying to do a tag team with Stephanie to make sure that we get the information to our attendees. And thank you also to Colleen Sherry for moderating. Great job of navigating all the questions, and to her organization GLJ Limited for sponsoring the webinar. Just a quick reminder, our next set of webinars will happen September 20th, September 27th, and October 4th. We'll provide more information as it becomes available, so look out for announcements on these particular items. So without further ado, I know we're slightly over time, but that's great. Love the dialogue and that the time just goes. So thank you once again to all of you for attending and taking the time to join us. Thank you again, John and Colleen, and see you all next time. Please stay safe, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.